The fork fell from my hand and clattered against my grandmother's antique china plate, the sound echoing through the sudden silence that had swallowed our dining room whole. I need you to know something before I tell you this story. If you've ever sat at a family table and felt like an outsider in your own home, if you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong in the very place that's supposed to love you unconditionally, then you'll understand what happened next. And if you're watching this from somewhere in the world where family is supposed to mean everything, please leave a comment and tell me where you're from, because what I'm about to share with you transcends borders, cultures, and continents. It's about the moment when the people who are supposed to protect you become the ones who destroy you. My sister Rachel's words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, acrid, suffocating, and impossible to escape. "You are a burden, Meredith. We want to live without you." The way she said my name, like it tasted bitter on her tongue, like even speaking it was an inconvenience she could no longer bear. I was 32 years old, sitting at the same Thanksgiving table where I'd carved turkeys as a child, where I'd announced my college acceptance, where I'd cried over my first heartbreak while my family rallied around me with tissues and ice cream. But that was before the accident that changed everything. Before I became what Rachel so eloquently called a burden. The accident happened 14 months earlier. I was driving home from my job at Morrison & Associates, the accounting firm where I'd worked my way up from receptionist to senior financial analyst over 8 years. It was raining, that particular northwest rain that doesn't pour but rather suffocates you with its persistence. A semi-truck ran a red light at the intersection of Cedar and Main. The impact sent my Honda Civic spinning like a child's toy, and when I woke up 3 days later in Sacred Heart Hospital, my life as I knew it was over. The doctors used words like traumatic brain injury, cognitive processing delays, and permanent disability. What they meant was that the woman who used to balance million-dollar budgets now struggled to remember if she'd taken her medication. The woman who used to run half marathons now needed a cane to walk to the mailbox. The woman who used to live independently in her downtown loft now needed help remembering to eat meals. My family, my parents, Robert and Linda Chun, my older sister Rachel, and her husband Mark, rallied around me initially. They moved me into my childhood bedroom, the one with the faded butterfly wallpaper I'd begged to change when I turned 16. They took turns driving me to physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. They smiled and nodded when doctors explained my limitations, when lawyers discussed settlement negotiations, when insurance companies found creative ways to deny coverage. But somewhere between month 6 and month 12, the smiles became strained. The helpful gestures turned into sighs. The patient explanations morphed into sharp corrections. My existence had become an inconvenience, a constant reminder of vulnerability and fragility that no one wanted to acknowledge. If you've made it this far in my story, please hit that subscribe button. Not because I want the numbers, but because sharing stories like this, stories about surviving when your own family discards you, might help someone else who's sitting in their own version of that dining room, feeling invisible and unwanted. Your subscription tells me that these words matter, that pain shared becomes pain diminished. The Thanksgiving dinner had started normally enough. Rachel had outdone herself with the decorations, autumn leaves scattered across the mahogany table, candles flickering in brass holders that belonged to our great-grandmother, the good silverware that only came out twice a year. She'd made our mother's stuffing recipe, the one with Italian sausage and dried cranberries that none of us kids could ever replicate quite right. The turkey was golden perfection, and the sweet potato casserole had that perfect marshmallow crust that bubbled just enough without burning. I'd contributed what I could, a simple green bean casserole that took me 4 hours to make because I kept losing track of the steps. My hands shook as I carried it to the table, and I'd forgotten to add the French fried onions until the very end, so they sat on top like an afterthought. Rachel had glanced at it and moved it to the far end of the table, near the dinner rolls no one ever ate. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Mark talked about his promotion at the software company. Dad discussed his retirement plans. Mom fussed over whether the gravy was too salty. Rachel detailed her latest interior design project, a multi-million-dollar home in the hills that would be featured in Pacific Northwest Living magazine. I tried to contribute. I mentioned a book I'd been reading, but couldn't remember the author's name mid-sentence. I started to tell them about my physical therapy progress, but the words came out jumbled, and I could see Rachel's jaw tighten with impatience. When I attempted to pour myself more wine, my hand trembled and drops splattered on the white tablecloth. "Jesus, Meredith," Rachel snapped, grabbing the bottle from me. "Can't you be more careful?" That's when it started to unravel. "I'm sorry," I whispered, dabbing at the tiny red stains with my napkin. "I'm still working on my fine motor skills." "You're always working on something," Mark muttered, not quite under his breath. My father cleared his throat, that warning sound he'd made when we were children, and the conversation was heading somewhere dangerous. But Rachel was past the point of heeding warnings. "Do you know what it's like?" she said, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea what it's like to have your life completely derailed because someone else can't take care of themselves?" The room went deadly quiet. Even the ancient grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to pause its ticking. "Rachel," my mother said softly, but it was too late. The dam had burst. "No, Mom. I'm done pretending this is okay. I'm done pretending that having a 32-year-old woman who can't remember to shower regularly living in our parents' house is somehow normal or sustainable." Rachel's voice cracked with frustration and something that sounded dangerously close to hatred. "I'm done pretending that every family gathering has to revolve around Meredith's limitations, Meredith's bad days, Meredith's needs." I felt my chest tighten, like someone was slowly turning a vice around my ribcage. "I never asked for this," I managed to say. "No, but you sure as hell embraced it." Rachel slammed her hand on the table, making the wine glasses jump. "You've turned helplessness into an art form. You've made being broken your entire identity." "That's enough," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it, Dad? Is it really enough? Because I can't do this anymore. Mark and I have been talking, and we can't keep enabling this situation." Rachel gestured at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. "We want to have children. We want to travel. We want to live our lives without constantly worrying about whether Meredith remembered to turn off the stove or whether she's going to have a meltdown in public because someone looked at her funny." The words hit me like physical blows. Each sentence was carefully chosen, precisely aimed at the parts of me that were already broken. "She's your sister," my mother whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No," Rachel said, standing up so abruptly her chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "She was my sister. The person sitting here now is a shell. A burden. And I'm done sacrificing my happiness for someone who gave up on herself months ago." That's when she said it. The words that would echo in my mind for the next 72 hours. The words that would become the catalyst for everything that followed. "You are a burden, Meredith. We want to live without you." The silence that followed was absolute. No one rushed to contradict her. No one jumped to my defense. My parents stared at their plates. Mark nodded almost imperceptibly. And I sat there, fork still on the floor, watching my family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, confirm that I was indeed too much trouble to be worth loving. I stood up slowly, my cane catching on the table leg. "I need some air," I said, and walked out of that dining room, out of that house, into the cold November evening where at least the darkness was honest about wanting nothing from me. But here's what Rachel didn't know as she watched me leave. Here's what none of them knew. That broken, helpless burden they decided they could no longer tolerate? She was about to remind them exactly why they should have been more careful with their words. The accident may have changed my brain, but it hadn't touched the part of me that remembered how to fight. And sometimes, when you've lost everything else, revenge becomes the only language left that everyone understands. The November air cut through my sweater like broken glass, each breath visible in small white puffs that disappeared as quickly as they formed. I walked slowly down Maple Street, the same street where I'd learned to ride a bike, where I'd walked to school every day for 12 years, where I'd snuck out to meet Tommy Hartwell when I was 17 and thought I knew what heartbreak was. My cane tapped against the sidewalk in an irregular rhythm, tap, shuffle, the sound echoing off the empty houses where normal families were probably finishing their Thanksgiving dinners, laughing over pumpkin pie, planning their Black Friday shopping strategies. The irony wasn't lost on me that the street I'd once raced down with scraped knees and boundless energy now felt like an endless marathon I wasn't sure I could finish. Every step took me further from the house where I'd grown up, but more importantly, every step took me closer to a clarity I hadn't felt since waking up in that hospital bed. The fog that had settled over my thoughts for the past 14 months, the medication fog, the grief fog, the fog of being treated like a child by people who used to respect me, was beginning to lift. Rachel's words played on repeat in my mind, but strangely, they no longer stung the way they had at the dinner table. Instead, they were transforming into something else entirely.
Fuel. Purpose.
The first real emotion I'd felt in months that wasn't disappointment or confusion, or the crushing weight of inadequacy. You know what's funny about rock bottom? People always talk about hitting it like it's the worst thing that can happen to you. But what they don't tell you is that rock bottom is solid. It's the first stable ground you've felt in months. It's the place where you finally stop falling and start planning your climb back up. I stopped walking when I reached the corner of Maple and Pine, where the old Henderson house sat dark and empty. Mrs. Henderson had died 6 months ago, and her children lived in different states, too busy with their own lives to deal with the estate. The for sale sign had been there so long it was starting to lean, and the lawn was overgrown with weeds that poked through the first snow of the season. That's when it hit me. The first piece of the puzzle that would become my revenge. Mrs. Henderson had been more than just a neighbor. She'd been my piano teacher from age 6 to 16, the woman who taught me that music was about more than hitting the right keys. It was about telling a story, about making people feel something they didn't expect to feel. After the accident, when I could barely remember my own phone number, she'd been one of the few people who still treated me like the person I used to be. "Your hands remember," she told me during one of her visits to my parents' house. I'd been frustrated because I couldn't play the simple melodies she'd written out for me, my fingers fumbling over keys I'd once navigated effortlessly. "Your brain might be healing, dear, but your hands remember every song you've ever played. Trust them." She'd been right. Slowly, painstakingly, pieces of music had started coming back to me. Not the complex classical pieces I'd mastered in high school, but simple melodies that my fingers seemed to find on their own. And with those melodies came memories, not just of songs, but of the person I'd been before the accident. The person who solved problems. The person who planned ahead. The person who didn't just accept defeat. Standing there in front of Mrs. Henderson's empty house, I realized something that made my heart race in a way it hadn't since before the accident. My family thought the accident had broken me beyond repair. They thought I was helpless, dependent, a shadow of my former self. But what if that was exactly the advantage I needed? If you're still with me on this journey, and I hope you are because this is where it gets interesting, take a moment to think about someone who underestimated you. Someone who dismissed you because they couldn't see past your struggles to recognize your strength. Hit that like button if you know what I'm talking about, because what happened next was me realizing that sometimes the greatest weapon you can have is people believing you're harmless. I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in months. I made a plan. First, I called a cab. Not because I couldn't walk the remaining 2 miles home, though my leg was starting to ache, but because I needed time to think without focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. While I waited, I opened the voice recorder app on my phone and began to speak quietly, testing whether my speech was clear enough to be understood. The therapist had been right about one thing: my cognitive processing was slower than it used to be. But they'd been wrong about something crucial. Slower didn't mean broken. It just meant I had to be more deliberate, more careful, more thorough. November 28th, I said into the phone. Thanksgiving Day. The day my sister Rachel decided I was too much trouble to love. The day my family chose convenience over compassion. The day I decided to remind them all exactly who they were dealing with. The cab arrived 15 minutes later, driven by a woman about my age with kind eyes and a University of Washington sweatshirt. She didn't comment on my cane or ask why I was out alone on Thanksgiving night. She just smiled and asked where I wanted to go. The downtown library, I said, though it was closed for the holiday. Actually, just drive past it first.
I need to see something.
As we drove through the empty downtown streets, I stared at the building where I'd worked for 8 years. Morrison and Associates occupied the third through fifth floors of the glass tower on Pine Street, and even though it was after 9 p.m. on a holiday, I could see lights on in several windows. The year-end audit season was approaching, which meant the senior partners would be working around the clock to meet client deadlines. I knew those lights. I knew the people behind them. More importantly, I knew their secrets. 8 years of processing payroll, managing expense reports, and balancing budgets had given me access to information that could destroy careers and marriages and topple the carefully constructed facades that held people's lives together. Before the accident, I'd been the soul of discretion, the trusted employee who knew where all the bodies were buried but would never consider digging them up. But that was before my family decided I was disposable. Actually, I told the cab driver, "Take me to the Fairmont Hotel instead." She glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "You sure? That's pretty expensive for just drinks." "I'm not going for drinks," I said. "I'm going to see an old friend." The Fairmont's lobby was exactly as I remembered it. All marble and gold fixtures, the kind of place where Seattle's elite conducted business over single malt scotch and handshake agreements. I'd been there dozens of times for company events, back when I was Richard Morrison's right hand, the person he trusted with his most sensitive financial information. I approached the concierge desk with more confidence than I'd felt in months. My cane was no longer a symbol of weakness. It was a prop in the performance I was about to give. "Excuse me," I said to the young man behind the desk. "I'm looking for Mr. Richard Morrison. He's usually in the bar around this time on holiday evenings." The concierge looked me up and down, taking in my casual sweater and jeans, clearly wondering if I belonged in a place like this. But then his eyes landed on my cane, and his expression softened into something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "I'll check for you, miss," he said gently. "May I tell him who's asking?" "Meredith Chun. Tell him it's about the Yamamoto account." I watched as recognition flickered across his face. The Yamamoto account had been front-page news 8 months ago when the Japanese electronics giant had chosen Morrison and Associates over 3 larger firms for their West Coast expansion audit. It was the kind of victory that made partners millions and secured reputations for decades. What the newspapers hadn't reported was that the Yamamoto deal had only happened because someone at Morrison and Associates had been selling confidential information about competing bids. Someone who had access to sealed proposals, client strategies, and bid amounts. Someone who had used that information to ensure Morrison's proposal was exactly $1 lower than their closest competitor. I discovered the discrepancy by accident, buried in expense reports I was reconciling for the quarterly review. Small payments to a consulting firm that didn't exist, disguised as legitimate business expenses, but traceable to a personal account that belonged to someone I'd trusted, someone who'd sent flowers to my hospital room and promised my job would be waiting when I recovered. Richard Morrison appeared in the lobby 10 minutes later, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, his expensive suit showing no signs of the bourbon I knew he'd been nursing. He'd always been handsome in that distinguished way that made clients trust him with their money, but tonight he looked older, more fragile than I remembered. "Meredith," he said, his voice warm, with what sounded like genuine pleasure. "My God, it's good to see you. How are you feeling? We've all been so worried." The kindness in his voice almost made me reconsider what I was about to do. "Almost. I'm doing much better, Richard. Thank you for asking. Actually, that's why I'm here. I've been going through some old files trying to organize my personal documents, and I found something that I think you should see." I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were photocopies of expense reports I'd discovered, bank statements I'd requested during my disability claim processing, and a detailed analysis I'd spent the last 6 months putting together during my clearest moments. Richard's face went pale as he glanced at the documents. "Perhaps we should discuss this somewhere more private," he said. "Of course," I replied. "Your office tomorrow morning? Say 9 a.m. He nodded, his hand trembling slightly as he handed the envelope back to me. "Meredith, I want you to know." "I know exactly what you want me to know, Richard. The question is, what are you willing to do to make sure I keep knowing it quietly?" That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by butterfly wallpaper and participation trophies, and plan the first move in a game that would either restore my dignity or destroy what was left of my relationships. But as I stared at my reflection in the vanity mirror where I'd practiced my first dance recital makeup, I realized something that made me smile for the first time in months. My family had made one crucial mistake when they decided I was broken beyond repair. They'd forgotten that I was still a Chen. And Chens don't just lie down and die. We get even. The Morrison and Associates building looked different at 9 a.m. on Black Friday morning. Most of the city was either sleeping off turkey comas or camping outside Best Buy for doorbuster deals, but the accounting world doesn't pause for retail therapy. The lobby buzzed with the quiet efficiency of people who make their living managing other people's money. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a navy blue suit I'd bought 3 years ago for client presentations, altered now to accommodate the weight I'd lost since the accident, paired with low heels I could manage without my cane. I wanted to look professional, capable, like the woman who used to command respect in conference rooms across the city. The elevator ride to the 5th floor felt like ascending to a different dimension, one where I'd once belonged but now felt like an intruder. My reflection in the polished steel doors showed someone who looked almost normal if you didn't know to watch for the slight tremor in my left hand or the way I had to concentrate to keep my balance. Richard's secretary, Patricia, looked up from her computer with a smile that faltered when she recognized me. Patricia had been with the company for 15 years, a motherly woman in her 60s who remembered everyone's birthday and kept a candy dish filled with butterscotch drops. She'd visited me twice in the hospital, bringing crossword puzzles and gossip from the office. "Meredith, sweetheart," she said, standing to embrace me carefully, as if I might break. "You look wonderful. Richard is waiting for you." She escorted me to the corner office I'd visited hundreds of times, where Richard Morrison had built an empire of trust and discretion. The walls were lined with photographs of him shaking hands with CEOs, politicians, and celebrities who'd trusted him with their financial secrets. His mahogany desk was clear except for a single manila folder, the same folder I'd handed him the night before. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Can Patricia get you anything?"
Coffee?
"Water." "I'm fine, thank you," I replied, settling into the chair with what I hoped looked like casual confidence. "I assume you've had a chance to review the documents." Richard opened the folder and spread the pages across his desk like a poker player revealing a losing hand. Bank statements, expense reports, email correspondence I'd printed before my accident. All evidence of what we both knew was insider trading disguised as legitimate business consulting. "These are quite serious allegations, Meredith," he said carefully. "I hope you understand that. They're not allegations, Richard. They're facts. Documented, verifiable facts that show someone in this company sold confidential information to ensure Morrison and Associates won the Yamamoto contract." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with the calculating look I'd seen him use during negotiations. "And you believe this someone was me?" "I don't believe anything," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I know. The payments to Hartwell Consulting, a company that doesn't exist beyond a P.O. box and a bank account. The timing of those payments, always within 48 hours of receiving competing bid information. The fact that David Hartwell is your nephew, the one who's been struggling with gambling debts for the past 2 years. I watched the color drain from his face as I laid out the connections I'd spent months piecing together. Even with my damaged brain, even with my slower processing speed, I was still an accountant. I still understood how money moved, how people hid their tracks, and how those tracks could be uncovered by someone who knew where to look. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "I want my life back," I said. "I want the respect I earned over 8 years of exemplary service. I want to stop being treated like a charity case or a burden that people tolerate out of pity. Your job is still here, Meredith. I told you that. As soon as your doctors clear you for full-time work." "I don't want my old job," I interrupted. "I want something better." I reached into my briefcase, the same leather briefcase I'd carried every day for 8 years, and pulled out a typed proposal I'd spent the previous evening crafting. "I want to start a new division," I said, sliding the document across his desk. Financial forensics. Corporate fraud investigation. Due diligence for mergers and acquisitions. There's a growing market for specialized accounting services, especially for companies that want to avoid the kind of scandal that destroyed Arthur Andersen. Richard picked up the proposal and began reading, his expression shifting from wariness to intrigue. I'd done my homework. The financial forensics field was exploding, driven by increased regulatory scrutiny and corporate governance requirements following recent accounting scandals. Seattle's business community was growing rapidly, but most companies still had to hire expensive consultants from San Francisco or Los Angeles for specialized investigative work. You want me to fund a new division based on your threat to expose my nephew's involvement in the Yamamoto deal? He asked. I want you to fund a new division because it's a smart business decision that will generate significant revenue within 18 months, I corrected. The fact that it also ensures your nephew's gambling problems remain a private family matter is simply a bonus. Here's something I need to tell everyone watching this story unfold. And please, if this resonates with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There's a difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is about hurting people who hurt you. Justice is about creating a situation where everyone gets what they deserve. What I was doing wasn't revenge.
Not yet.
This was just leveling the playing field. Richard set down the proposal and looked at me with something that might have been respect. You've thought this through. I've had a lot of time to think recently, I said. 14 months of being underestimated tends to sharpen one's focus. And if I refuse? Then I take these documents to the State Board of Accountancy, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Seattle Times business section. The Yamamoto deal becomes the scandal that ends Morrison and Associates. Your nephew goes to prison for securities fraud, and I find another way to rebuild my career. And if I agree? Then Morrison and Associates becomes the premier forensic accounting firm in the Pacific Northwest. You get to retire with your reputation intact. David gets help for his gambling addiction and a chance to start over. And I get to prove that surviving a traumatic brain injury doesn't make someone weak. It just makes them more determined. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see shoppers streaming toward the mall, families laughing and chatting as they planned their holiday purchases. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that 30 floors above them, a woman they would have dismissed as disabled was negotiating her way back to power. What would you need to get started? Richard asked finally. An office, a secretary, access to the company's research databases, and a budget for specialized software. I'll also need hiring authority for when the division grows. And you think you can handle this? With your condition? I smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. Richard, my condition is that I remember every financial transaction I've ever seen. I notice discrepancies other people miss, and I have the patience to spend months tracking down patterns that lead to the truth. In forensic accounting, those aren't disabilities, they're superpowers. He laughed despite himself. When would you want to start? Monday morning, I said. I'll need this weekend to set up my office and review potential cases. We spent the next hour working out the details, my salary, the division's budget, reporting structure, and most importantly, the confidentiality agreement that would keep David's gambling problems and Richard's ethical lapses out of public scrutiny. As I prepared to leave, Richard stood and extended his hand. Meredith, I want you to know that I never doubted your abilities. The accident was tragic, but it doesn't define who you are. No, I agreed, shaking his hand with a grip that was steadier than it had been in months. But how people treat you after tragedy shows you exactly who they are. I left Morrison and Associates that morning with more than just a new job. I left with the first piece of my revenge plan in place. My family thought I was helpless, dependent, a burden they could discard without consequence. They were about to learn that the woman they'd written off had just gained access to financial information on half of Seattle's elite, including the law firm where my brother-in-law Mark worked, the real estate development company that handled my father's retirement investments, and the interior design business that my sister Rachel was so proud of. Phase 1 of my plan was complete. Phase 2 would require a different kind of patience, a different kind of skill. But as I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I was already planning my next move. After all, I was no longer just Meredith Chen, the brain injury survivor who needed help remembering to eat meals. I was Meredith Chen, director of forensic accounting at Morrison and Associates. And I had access to everyone's secrets, including my family's. The weekend between Black Friday and the following Monday felt like the first time in 14 months that I had genuine purpose. I spent Saturday setting up my new office, a corner space on the 4th floor with windows overlooking Elliott Bay and enough room for the specialized computers and filing systems I'd need for forensic investigation work. Sunday, I did something I hadn't done since before the accident. I went shopping. Not the kind of shopping where someone else pushes the cart and makes the decisions while I shuffle along behind them, but real shopping. I bought professional clothes that fit my new body, a briefcase to replace the one that carried too many memories of my old life, and most importantly, a new laptop with the kind of processing power that could handle the massive databases I'd be analyzing. But Monday morning was when the real work began. And by real work, I mean the careful, methodical process of gathering the information I'd need to remind my family exactly what kind of person they decided to discard. Patricia had outdone herself with my office setup. My desk was equipped with dual monitors, a high-speed scanner, and access to every financial database Morrison and Associates subscribed to. More importantly, she'd compiled a welcome packet that included login credentials for public records databases, professional networking sites, and the kind of information services that made my old job in general accounting look like child's play. I took the liberty of pulling some preliminary case files, she told me as she showed me around the office. Richard thought you might want to start with something straightforward to get back into the rhythm. The files she'd selected were perfect for someone easing back into complex analytical work, a small embezzlement case involving a nonprofit's treasurer, a divorce proceeding that required asset verification, and a pre-acquisition audit for a mid-sized tech company. Bread and butter work that would let me rebuild my confidence while generating billable hours for the firm. But those cases weren't what interested me most. What interested me were the access permissions that came with my new position. As the director of forensic accounting, I had legitimate reasons to access public records, property transactions, business filings, and financial disclosures for any individual or company in Washington state. I could request bank records, review mortgage applications, and examine tax liens under the umbrella of due diligence and fraud investigation. Most importantly, I could do all of this legally, ethically, and without anyone questioning my motives. I started with my brother-in-law, Mark. Mark Patterson worked as a senior associate at Brennan, Kellaway and Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms. He specialized in corporate mergers and acquisitions, the kind of high-stakes legal work that generated massive fees and attracted clients who expected absolute discretion. He'd been with the firm for 6 years, ever since graduating from University of Washington Law School with honors and a mountain of student debt. What I found in the first hour of searching made me lean back in my chair and smile. Mark's financial records were a fascinating study in someone living well beyond his means. His salary at Brennan Kellaway was substantial, $180,000 a year plus bonuses, but not substantial enough to support the lifestyle he and Rachel had been maintaining. The mortgage on their queen and home was $3,800 a month. His BMW lease payment was $650. Rachel's Mercedes was another $720. Add in credit card minimum payments, student loans, and the kind of discretionary spending that comes with trying to impress Seattle's social elite, and Mark was spending roughly $2,000 more per month than he earned. The gap was being filled by a series of personal loans from a company called Pacific Northwest Financial Services. Small amounts at first, $5,000 here, $3,000 there, but escalating over the past 18 months to larger sums. The most recent loan, taken out just 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, was for $25,000 at an interest rate that could only be described as predatory. Pacific Northwest Financial Services wasn't a bank. It was a private lending company that specialized in short-term, high-interest loans to professionals who couldn't qualify for traditional bank financing. The kind of company that didn't ask too many questions about why someone needed money quickly, as long as they had sufficient collateral and income to service the debt. The kind of company that people only used when they were desperate. But Mark's financial problems were just the appetizer. Rachel's interior design business was where things got truly interesting. Rachel had started Chin Design Studio 3 years ago, capitalizing on her natural artistic ability and the network of wealthy connections she developed through Mark's law firm. Her business model was elegant. She'd take on high-end residential projects, coordinating with architects, contractors, and specialty vendors to create magazine-worthy interiors for Seattle's elite. Her client list read like a who's who of the city's power structure: tech executives, real estate developers, politicians, and old money families who'd been Seattle royalty since before Microsoft existed. Projects that ranged from $50,000 bathroom renovations to million-dollar home makeovers that required months of coordination and access to the most exclusive showrooms and artisan workshops. What made Rachel's business model particularly clever was that she didn't just charge design fees. She also took commissions from every vendor, contractor, and artisan involved in each project. A percentage of the furniture costs, a cut of the construction work, a piece of every transaction that touched her designs. It was perfectly legal and commonly practiced in the industry. It was also the perfect setup for the kind of fraud that could destroy careers and send people to prison. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday diving deeper into Rachel's business records, cross-referencing her client invoices with vendor payments, contractor work orders, and city building permits. What I found was a pattern that made my pulse quicken with anticipation. If you've ever wondered how someone can seem to have everything together on the surface while their whole life is built on lies, you're about to find out. And if you've made it this far in my story, please take a moment to comment below. I want to know if you've ever discovered something about someone close to you that completely changed how you saw them. Because what I found about Rachel made me realize I'd never really known my sister at all. Rachel had been systematically overcharging her clients for materials and labor, then pocketing the difference. But it wasn't simple markup inflation that would have been too obvious and too easy to detect. Instead, she'd created an elaborate system of phantom vendors and inflated invoices that let her skim thousands of dollars from each project while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business practices. Here's how it worked. Rachel would get quotes from real contractors and suppliers for legitimate work: flooring, lighting, custom cabinetry, paint, fabrics. But instead of using those actual vendors, she'd create fake companies with similar names and submit invoices for 20 to 40% more than the real quotes. Northwest Custom Millwork instead of Northwest Millwork Company. Seattle Lighting Solutions instead of Seattle Lighting Supply. Close enough that busy, wealthy clients wouldn't notice the difference, different enough that the money flowed to accounts Rachel controlled. The real work would still get done, of course. Rachel would pay the legitimate vendors their quoted amounts, pocket the difference, and deliver the promised results to her clients. Everyone was happy. The clients got beautiful interiors, the real vendors got paid fairly, and Rachel got rich skimming from people who had so much money they didn't bother to verify the details. It was brilliant. It was creative. It was the kind of sophisticated fraud that could only be detected by someone who knew how to trace money through multiple accounts and shell companies. Someone like a forensic accountant. By Thursday afternoon, I had enough evidence to prove that Rachel had stolen approximately $340,000 from her clients over the past 2 years. Tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, federal charges that could result in a decade in prison and the complete destruction of everything she'd built. But I wasn't done yet. Because while I was investigating Rachel's business practices, I'd stumbled across something even more interesting. Something that connected my sister's fraud to my brother-in-law's financial desperation in a way that made my hands shake with anticipation. The Pacific Northwest Financial Services loans that Mark had been taking weren't just about maintaining an expensive lifestyle. They were bridge loans, short-term financing designed to cover cash flow gaps in Rachel's business. Money she borrowed against future project payments to fund the upfront costs of her fraudulent invoicing scheme. The beautiful queen and home they were so proud of wasn't financed through Mark's legal career. It was purchased with money Rachel had stolen from clients who trusted her with their most intimate spaces, people who'd invited her into their homes and their lives, who'd shared their dreams and vulnerabilities while she calculated how much she could steal from them. Every dinner party they'd hosted, every vacation they'd taken, every expensive bottle of wine they'd served at family gatherings, All of it paid for with money stolen from people who'd considered Rachel not just their interior designer, but their friend. And the most beautiful part? Rachel had been so confident in her scheme, so certain that her clients would never notice the inflated invoices, that she'd kept meticulous records. Spreadsheets tracking her phantom companies, bank statements showing the flow of stolen money, even photographs of completed projects with detailed cost breakdowns that proved the gap between what clients paid and what the work actually cost. She'd documented her own crimes with the thoroughness of someone who never imagined she'd be caught. But here's what made my pulse race with something that felt dangerously close to joy. I wasn't the only one who could access this information. As part of my forensic accounting work, I'd been building relationships with investigators at the IRS, the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, and the Washington State Attorney General's office. Professional connections that would be essential for the legitimate cases I'd be handling in my new role. Connections that would also be very interested to learn about a sophisticated fraud scheme operating in Seattle's most exclusive neighborhoods. I printed out the key documents and organized them into a file folder labeled Chen Design Studio, Preliminary Investigation. Then I locked it in my desk drawer and went home to have dinner with a family that had decided I was too much trouble to love. That evening, as I sat at the kitchen table where Rachel had destroyed me 5 days earlier, I watched her bustling around the kitchen, preparing leftover turkey sandwiches and chatting excitedly about a new project she'd just landed, a $200,000 penthouse renovation for a tech executive who'd made his fortune in cloud computing. It's going to be featured in Architectural Digest, she told our parents, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. The photographer is coming next month, and they want to do a whole spread on Seattle's emerging design talent. She looked so happy, so confident in her success, so certain that her world was built on solid ground. She had no idea that 30 floors above us, in a corner office overlooking Elliott Bay, her entire life was documented in a manila folder that could destroy everything she'd worked for with a single phone call. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," our mother said, beaming with pride. "You've built such an amazing business." "It took a lot of hard work," Rachel replied, glancing at me with a look that made it clear she thought I wouldn't understand what hard work meant. "But when you're willing to do what it takes to succeed, when you don't just give up when things get difficult, you can accomplish anything." I smiled and nodded, taking another bite of my turkey sandwich. "You're absolutely right, Rachel. When you're willing to do what it takes, when you don't give up when things get difficult, you really can accomplish anything." She looked at me sharply, as if she'd heard something in my tone that didn't match my words. But then she shook her head and went back to her conversation with our parents, dismissing whatever instinct had made her pay attention to the broken sister who'd been relegated to the children's table of family discussions. That night, I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the butterfly wallpaper and planning the next phase of my revenge. I had enough evidence to destroy both Rachel and Mark, but simply turning them into the authorities felt too easy, too impersonal. They'd humiliated me in front of our entire family. They'd made me feel worthless, disposable, a burden that everyone would be happier without. A quick arrest and prosecution wouldn't give them the chance to experience what I'd experienced, the slow, crushing realization that the people you trust most in the world see you as nothing more than an inconvenience to be discarded. No, I wanted them to understand exactly how it felt to watch your entire life crumble while the people who were supposed to love you stood by and did nothing to help. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be truly helpless. And I was going to give them that gift, slowly and carefully, with all the patience and precision that my damaged brain could muster. After all, I was still a Chen. And Chens always finish what they start. The first week of December brought Seattle's signature drizzle, the kind of persistent gray rain that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel muted and fragile. Perfect weather for the delicate work I had planned. I'd spent the past week establishing my credibility at Morrison & Associates, successfully closing the nonprofit embezzlement case and identifying $47,000 in missing funds that would be recovered and returned to the children's literacy program it was supposed to support. Richard Morrison made a point of mentioning my success during the Monday morning partner meeting, praising my attention to detail and analytical skills to colleagues who remembered me as the brain injury victim they'd sent flowers to in the hospital. But my real work was happening in the quiet hours after the office emptied, when I had uninterrupted access to the databases and resources that would allow me to orchestrate my family's downfall with surgical precision. The key to effective revenge, I'd learned, wasn't violence or dramatic confrontation. It was information. More specifically, it was knowing exactly when and how to release information for maximum impact. Like a controlled demolition, you had to understand the structure you were trying to collapse, identify the load-bearing elements, and then remove them in precisely the right order to ensure the whole thing came down cleanly. Rachel and Mark's marriage was built on a foundation of financial fraud and lies. But simply exposing that fraud wouldn't be enough. I needed to create a cascade of consequences that would strip away everything they valued most: their reputation, their social status, their sense of security, and ultimately, their ability to dismiss other people as inconvenient burdens. Phase 2 began with a phone call to someone I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Jennifer Morrison speaking. Jennifer was Richard's daughter, an investigative journalist who'd built her reputation exposing corruption in Seattle's tech industry. She'd won a Pulitzer nomination for her series on tax evasion among Amazon executives, and her byline in the Seattle Times carried enough weight to end careers and launch federal investigations. More importantly, Jennifer had a personal grudge against exclusive interior designers who catered to the tech elite. Jennifer, it's Meredith Chun from Morrison and Associates. I don't know if you remember me. Of course I remember you, she interrupted. How are you doing? Dad told me about your accident. I'm so sorry that happened. I'm doing much better, thank you. Actually, I'm calling because I may have a story that would interest you. It involves fraud in Seattle's luxury interior design industry, with connections to some of the tech executives you've written about. The pause on the other end of the line told me I had her attention. What kind of fraud? She asked. The kind where wealthy clients pay premium prices for custom work, but the designer creates fake companies to inflate invoices and pocket the difference. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from people who trusted their designer with access to their homes, their finances, and their personal lives. Do you have documentation? I have everything. Bank records, fake invoices, shell company registrations, client contracts, the works. But I need to handle this carefully. Some of the victims are prominent people who value their privacy. Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow afternoon? I'd like to see what you have. Of course. But Jennifer? This conversation never happened. I'm giving you information as a concerned citizen who discovered evidence of fraud, not as an employee of Morrison and Associates. Understood. Dad always said you were one of the smartest people he'd ever worked with. After I hung up, I spent the evening preparing a carefully curated selection of documents that would tell the story I wanted Jennifer to investigate. Not everything. I wasn't ready to reveal the full extent of Rachel's crimes, but enough to establish the pattern and give Jennifer leads to follow. The next afternoon, I met Jennifer at a small coffee shop in Capitol Hill, far from the downtown business district where we might be recognized. She was younger than I remembered, probably early 30s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that made sources want to confess their secrets and criminals want to run. This is impressive work, she said, flipping through the documents I'd brought. How did you come across this information? I've been doing some forensic accounting work, and this designer's invoicing patterns caught my attention. The phantom vendors, the inflated costs, it's textbook fraud, but sophisticated enough that most clients wouldn't catch it. Have you contacted the authorities? Not yet. I wanted to understand the full scope first. But Jennifer, if you decide to investigate this story, you should know that the designer I'm talking about is my sister. She looked up from the documents, her expression shifting from professional interest to something that looked like concern. Your sister is defrauding her clients? My sister told me last week that I was a burden and that my family wanted to live without me. She said this while sitting in a home purchased with money stolen from people who trusted her. I kept my voice steady, professional. I believe the public has a right to know when someone in a position of trust is abusing that trust for personal gain. Jennifer studied my face carefully. This isn't about exposing fraud. This is about revenge. This is about justice, I corrected. Revenge would be anonymous tips to the IRS and letting Rachel figure out on her own that her life is falling apart. Justice is making sure her victims know they've been robbed and giving them the chance to recover what was stolen from them. And if I write this story, your sister goes to prison. If you write this story, my sister faces the consequences of her choices. Just like I'm facing the consequences of mine. Jennifer closed the document folder and looked at me with something that might have been respect. I need to verify everything independently. I won't take your word for any of this, even though I trust your analytical skills. I wouldn't expect you to. That's why I brought copies of public records, bank documents, and client contracts that you can authenticate through your own sources. And you understand that once I start investigating, I can't control where the story goes? If I find evidence of other crimes, if this connects to other people, if the scope is bigger than what you've shown me. I understand. I'm not asking you to limit your investigation. I'm asking you to follow the evidence wherever it leads. We talked for another hour, with Jennifer asking detailed questions about the documents and taking notes on leads she wanted to pursue. When we parted ways, I knew that I'd just set in motion a chain of events that would destroy my sister's life more thoroughly than any revenge fantasy I could have imagined. But I wasn't done, because while Jennifer investigated Rachel's fraud, I had other work to do. That evening, I drove to Mark's law firm and waited in the parking garage until he left for the day. I followed him at a distance as he stopped at a small, nondescript office building in South Seattle, the kind of place that housed bail bondsmen, check cashing services, and businesses that preferred to operate without too much scrutiny. Pacific Northwest Financial Services occupied a ground-floor suite with tinted windows and a door that required a buzzer for entry. I watched Mark go inside and emerged 20 minutes later looking like someone who'd just received very bad news. The next morning, I made a phone call to my contact at the FBI's white-collar crime division. Agent Rodriguez? This is Meredith Chun from Morrison & Associates. I have some information about a potential money laundering operation that I think you should know about. What kind of operation? A private lending company that's making high-interest loans to professionals who can't qualify for bank financing. The loans are secured by stolen money being funneled through shell companies in the interior design industry. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimate? $500,000 over 2 years, with connections to wire fraud, tax evasion, and potentially RICO violations if the lending company is part of a larger criminal enterprise. Can you come in tomorrow morning? I'd like to see what you have. Of course. But Agent Rodriguez? One of the people involved is my brother-in-law. I want to make sure this investigation is handled by the book, no special treatment because of family connections. Understood. We'll treat this like any other financial crimes case. After I hung up, I sat in my office looking out at Elliott Bay, watching ferries carry commuters to their normal lives, and felt something I hadn't experienced since before the accident. I felt powerful. Not the artificial power that comes from controlling other people, but the real power that comes from understanding exactly how the world works and having the skills to navigate it effectively. My family had made the mistake of thinking that surviving a brain injury had made me weak. They'd forgotten that I was still the same person who'd built a successful career by understanding how money moved through complex systems, who'd earned the trust of Seattle's business elite by being smarter and more thorough than anyone expected. They'd forgotten that intelligence isn't about processing speed. It's about pattern recognition, patience, and the ability to see connections that other people miss. And they were about to learn that lesson in the most expensive way possible. If you're still with me on this journey, and please let me know in the comments if you are, then you understand that this isn't really a story about revenge. It's a story about what happens when people underestimate someone who's been underestimated their entire life. Someone who's learned that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. Because the thing about hitting rock bottom is that it teaches you exactly what you're capable of when you have nothing left to lose. And I was just getting started. December 15th was the day everything started unraveling for Rachel, though she wouldn't understand the significance until much later. I was in my office, working on a legitimate case involving a cryptocurrency exchange that had mysteriously lost $2.3 million in client funds, when Patricia knocked on my door with an expression that suggested she had news. "Meredith, there's a Jennifer Morrison here to see you. She says it's about a story she's working on." I'd been expecting this visit, but the timing was perfect. Rachel was supposed to meet with her biggest client that afternoon, Victoria Chin-Williams, the tech heiress who'd hired Rachel to renovate her $4.2 million penthouse overlooking Puget Sound. The same project Rachel had been bragging about at Thanksgiving dinner, the one that was supposed to be featured in Architectural Digest. "Send her in," I told Patricia. Jennifer looked like she hadn't slept much in the past 2 weeks, which told me she'd been thorough in her investigation. She carried a thick folder and a digital recorder, along with the kind of focused energy that journalists get when they know they're about to break a big story. "I need to ask you some follow-up questions," she said without preamble. "The story is bigger than what you initially showed me." "How much bigger?" "Your sister isn't just defrauding individual clients. She's part of a network of contractors and suppliers who've been systematically overcharging wealthy homeowners throughout Seattle for the past 3 years. We're talking about millions of dollars in coordinated fraud across dozens of high-end projects." I felt my breath catch. This was beyond what I discovered in my own investigation, beyond what I'd expected Jennifer to uncover. "You're sure about this?" "I've verified everything through multiple sources. Bank records, vendor agreements, client contracts, building permits. The whole thing is documented. Your sister appears to be one of the key coordinators, using her client relationships to identify targets and her business connections to orchestrate the overcharging schemes." She opened her folder and spread out a series of photographs, documents, and what looked like surveillance photos taken from a distance. "This is from last Tuesday," she said, pointing to a photo of Rachel meeting with 2 men in expensive suits outside a downtown restaurant. "The guy on the left is Marcus Torres, who owns Torres Custom Millwork. The guy on the right is David Kim from Seattle Luxury Lighting. Both of them have been submitting inflated invoices that match your sister's phantom company scheme exactly. They're coordinating their fraud? More than that. They're sharing client information, coordinating project timelines, and splitting the profits according to a formula that gives your sister a percentage of every fraudulent transaction in their network." Jennifer showed me spreadsheets that detailed a criminal enterprise far more sophisticated than anything I'd imagined. Rachel wasn't just stealing from her own clients. She was the hub of a criminal network that had systematically targeted Seattle's wealthiest homeowners for coordinated fraud. "When does your story run?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning, front page of the business section. But Meredith, there's something else you need to know." I contacted several of the victims to give them a chance to respond. "Victoria Chin-Williams wants to meet with your sister this afternoon to discuss the allegations." My pulse quickened. Victoria Chin-Williams wasn't just any client. She was Seattle royalty, the granddaughter of a shipping magnate who'd helped build the city's port infrastructure. She sat on the boards of the Symphony, the Art Museum, and 3 major charitable foundations. When Victoria Chin-Williams had a problem with someone, that person became unemployable in Seattle's social circles overnight. "Does Rachel know about the meeting's real purpose?" I asked. Victoria's assistant told her it was about finalizing the penthouse project timeline. "She has no idea what's coming." After Jennifer left, I sat in my office staring at my phone.
I had a choice to make.
I could call Rachel and warn her, give her a chance to prepare for what was about to hit. Or I could let her walk into that meeting completely unprepared, the same way she'd let me walk into that Thanksgiving dinner unprepared for the emotional devastation she was about to unleash. I chose to let her discover the consequences of her actions the same way I discovered the consequences of mine. Suddenly, brutally, and without any support from the people who were supposed to love her. At 3:47 p.m., my phone rang. "Meredith?" Rachel's voice was shaking. "Something terrible has happened. I don't know what to do." "What's wrong?" I asked, though I already knew. "Victoria Chin-Williams just accused me of stealing from her. She had documents, bank records. She knew about vendors I'd never told her about. She's threatening to press charges, to call the police, to..." Rachel's voice broke into sobs. "She said I'm a thief. She called me a thief, Meredith." "Where are you now?" "I'm in my car outside her building. I can't go home. I can't face Mark. What am I going to tell him?" For a moment, listening to my sister cry, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost remembered the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who defended me against playground bullies, who taught me how to braid friendship bracelets and keep secrets. But then I remembered her words at Thanksgiving dinner. "You are a burden, Meredith. We want to live without you." "Rachel, you need to call a lawyer," I said. "Don't talk to anyone else until you have legal representation." "I can't afford a lawyer. We're already behind on our mortgage and the business accounts are—" "God, if they freeze the business accounts, we'll lose everything." "What about Mark? Can his firm help?" "Mark doesn't know," she whispered. "He doesn't know about any of this. He thinks the business is successful, that we're doing well. If he finds out, he's going to find out, Rachel. This isn't something you can hide." "Please," she said, and I heard desperation in her voice that reminded me of the desperation I'd felt sitting at that Thanksgiving table.
"Please help me."
I know what I said last week was wrong. I was frustrated and tired, and I took it out on you. But you're my sister. You're the only person who might understand. Understand what? Understand what it's like when your whole life falls apart and everyone you trusted abandons you. The irony was so perfect it took my breath away. Rachel was asking me to help her navigate exactly the situation she'd put me in, asking for the support and understanding she'd refused to give me when I needed it most. "I'll see what I can do," I told her, though I already knew exactly what I was going to do. That evening, I called Agent Rodriguez at the FBI. "Agent Rodriguez? This is Meredith Chen. I have an update on the money laundering case I brought to your attention. It appears that one of the subjects is ready to cooperate with your investigation." "Which subject?" "Rachel Chen, my sister. She's facing fraud charges from one of her victims, and she's indicated that she might be willing to provide information about the broader criminal network in exchange for consideration." "Has she retained counsel?" "Not yet. She's asked me to help her find appropriate representation, which is why I'm calling you. I think it would be beneficial for everyone if she understood her options before she makes any decisions about how to proceed. We'd be very interested in talking to her, especially if she has information about the coordination between multiple contractors and suppliers." "She does. She's one of the primary coordinators. But Agent Rodriguez? I want to be clear that I'm not asking for special treatment because she's my sister. I'm asking you to give her the same opportunity you'd give any other criminal who could help you build a case against a larger organization." "Understood. Can you have her come in tomorrow morning?" "I'll arrange it." After I hung up, I sat in my childhood bedroom, looking at the butterfly wallpaper that had witnessed so many important moments in my life, and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction exactly, and not quite justice. Something more complex, something that tasted like closure and possibility, and the first real breath I'd taken since waking up in that hospital bed. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rachel. "Thank you for helping me. I know I don't deserve it after what I said." I typed back, "You're right. You don't deserve it. But I'm not doing this for you." "Then why?" "Because someone needs to make sure you face the consequences of your choices. And I'd rather those consequences come from the justice system than from the kind of revenge you'd never recover from." There was a long pause before her response. "What do you mean?" "I mean that tomorrow morning, you're going to meet with FBI Agent Rodriguez to discuss your cooperation in a federal fraud investigation. You're going to tell him everything about your criminal network, and you're going to accept whatever deal he offers you. Because the alternative is spending the next decade in federal prison while Mark loses his law license and your victims sue you for everything you've ever owned." My phone started ringing immediately, but I turned it off and went to sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new phases of the plan I'd been carefully orchestrating. But tonight, for the first time in 14 months, I slept peacefully. Because tomorrow, Rachel would learn what it felt like to have your entire world collapse while the people who were supposed to love you stood by and watched it happen. And unlike me, she'd brought it entirely on herself. The Seattle Times hit the newsstands at 6 a.m. on December 16th with a front-page headline that made my coffee taste like victory. Exclusive: Seattle interior designer accused of million-dollar fraud network. Jennifer Morrison's byline was prominently displayed above a story that detailed not just Rachel's crimes, but the entire criminal enterprise she'd helped orchestrate. Photographs of luxury homes that had been targeted, interviews with victims who'd trusted Rachel with their most intimate spaces, and financial documents that proved the scope of the fraud was even larger than I'd initially discovered. But the most damaging part of the article wasn't the evidence of criminal activity. It was the way Jennifer had framed the story. She'd interviewed several of Rachel's victims, and their quotes painted a picture of someone who'd betrayed not just their trust, but their friendship. Rachel Chen wasn't just our interior designer. Victoria Chen Williams was quoted as saying, "She was someone I considered a friend. I invited her to family dinners, included her in social events, trusted her with access to my home when I wasn't there. To discover that she was systematically stealing from me while pretending to care about my family is a betrayal that goes far beyond financial crime." Another client, tech executive David Morrison, no relation to my boss, described how Rachel had convinced him to install a $30,000 smart home system that actually cost $18,000, with the extra money flowing to one of her phantom companies. She sat in my living room, held my newborn daughter, and talked about how important it was to create a safe, beautiful environment for children to grow up in. The whole time, she was calculating how much she could steal from us. By 8 a.m., every major news outlet in Seattle was running follow-up stories. By 9 a.m., the FBI had executed search warrants on Rachel's office, her home, and the offices of Torres Custom Millwork and Seattle Luxury Lighting. By 10 a.m., Rachel's business phone was disconnected and her website had been taken down. I was in my office, ostensibly working on the cryptocurrency case but actually monitoring news coverage on my computer when Patricia knocked on my door. "Your sister is here to see you," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "She looks upset." Rachel walked into my office looking like someone who'd aged 10 years overnight. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She moved with the careful, deliberate steps of someone in shock. "You knew," she said without sitting down. "You knew this was going to happen." "I knew you'd committed fraud," I replied calmly. "I knew there would be consequences eventually. You could have warned me. You could have given me a chance to fix it. The way you gave me a chance to prepare for Thanksgiving dinner?" She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact moment when understanding dawned in her eyes. "This is about what I said last week." "This is about what you've been doing for 3 years, I corrected. "Stealing from people who trusted you, lying to your husband, building a life on money that wasn't yours. What I said was just the catalyst that made me decide to stop pretending I didn't know about it. You've been investigating me. I've been doing my job. Forensic accounting involves identifying patterns of financial fraud. Your business practices created patterns that were impossible to ignore once I started looking." Rachel sank into one of the chairs facing my desk, and for a moment she looked exactly like she had when we were children and she'd been caught in some elaborate scheme to avoid getting in trouble. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you go to the FBI meeting we arranged for 10 a.m. You tell Agent Rodriguez everything you know about the criminal network you helped create. You provide names, bank account numbers, documentation of how the fraud was coordinated. You accept whatever plea deal they offer you, and you hope it's enough to keep you out of federal prison. And Mark's going to find out that his wife is a criminal and his lifestyle was funded by stolen money. He's probably going to divorce you, and he may face charges himself if the FBI can prove he knew about the source of your income." "He didn't know," Rachel said quickly. "I kept the business finances completely separate. He never asked questions about where the money came from." "Then he's luckier than he deserves to be." Rachel was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at Elliott Bay. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was trying to build something," she said. "I wanted to be successful, to prove that I could create a business that mattered. I never meant for it to get this complicated." "You meant to steal," I said bluntly. "You meant to lie to people who trusted you. You meant to build your success on other people's money. The fact that it got complicated doesn't change your intent. You really hate me, don't you?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't hate you, Rachel. But I don't love you either. Love requires respect, and I can't respect someone who would steal from friends and then call their brain-injured sister a burden." She started crying again, The kind of desperate sobs that come from someone who's finally understanding the full scope of what they've lost. "I'm sorry," she said between sobs. "I'm so sorry about what I said. I was frustrated and scared and I took it out on you, but I didn't mean it." "Yes, you did," I said. "You meant every word. You've been thinking those things about me for months, maybe years. The only thing you're sorry about is that saying them out loud led to consequences you didn't anticipate." I walked around my desk and handed her a tissue box, but I didn't try to comfort her. I'd learned something important about myself over the past few weeks. I was capable of causing pain without enjoying it, of delivering justice without taking pleasure in someone else's suffering. "The FBI meeting is in an hour," I told her. "You need to leave now if you're going to make it." She stood up slowly, clutching the tissue box like a lifeline. Will you come with me?" I know I don't deserve to ask, but I'm scared." "No," I said. "You're going to face this alone, the same way you expected me to face my recovery alone." After she left, I sat in my office and felt something I hadn't expected: emptiness. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just a hollow feeling where I'd expected triumph to be. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. "Meredith? This is Mark." His voice sounded strained, desperate. "I need to talk to you about Rachel." "What about her?" "She's been arrested. The FBI took her from some meeting this morning, and they're saying she's part of some fraud investigation. They've frozen all our accounts. They're searching our house. They want to question me about money laundering." He paused, and I could hear him trying to control his breathing. "I don't understand what's happening," he continued. "Yesterday we were planning Christmas dinner, and today my wife is in federal custody and agents are going through our financial records. What the hell is going on?" "Rachel has been stealing from her clients," I said simply. "The FBI is investigating a criminal network that defrauded Seattle homeowners out of millions of dollars. Your wife was one of the primary coordinators." "That's impossible. Rachel would never." "Rachel would, and did. The evidence is overwhelming. She's probably going to plead guilty to federal fraud charges and cooperate with the investigation to reduce her sentence." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. "How long have you known?" he asked finally. "I started investigating her business practices 2 weeks ago. I turned my findings over to a journalist and the FBI last week." "You turned in your own sister?" "I turned in a criminal who happened to be my sister," I corrected. "The same sister who told me I was a burden and that my family wanted to live without me." She said that. She said exactly that at Thanksgiving dinner, in front of our parents. None of you contradicted her. Mark was quiet again, and when he spoke, his voice was different. Smaller. "I didn't know," he said. "About the business, about what she was doing. I thought the money was coming from legitimate design work." "I believe you," I said. "Which is why you're not in federal custody right now." "What am I supposed to do?" "They've frozen our accounts. They're talking about seizing our house. My law firm is probably going to put me on administrative leave until this is resolved. My career is over." "Your career isn't over unless you were complicit in Rachel's crimes," I said. "If you're innocent, you'll survive this. It won't be easy, and it won't be comfortable, but you'll survive." "How can you be so calm about this? This is your family, too." "This stopped being about family when Rachel decided I wasn't worth keeping around," I replied. "Now it's about justice. Rachel committed crimes, and she's facing the consequences. You benefited from those crimes unknowingly, so you're facing consequences too. That's how justice works." Jesus, Meredith. When did you become so cold? I thought about that question for a moment. When had I become cold? Was it when I woke up in the hospital and realized my life was over? Was it during the months of therapy when I had to relearn how to be a functional human being? Was it watching my family's patients wear thin as they realized I wasn't going to magically return to the person I'd been before? Or was it last Thursday, sitting at a Thanksgiving dinner table listening to my sister tell me I was too much trouble to love? I became cold when I realized that warmth was a luxury I couldn't afford. I told Mark, when you're fighting to survive, when you're rebuilding your entire identity from scratch, when the people who are supposed to support you decide you're too much work, that's when you learn that emotions are tools, not destinations. I hung up before he could respond. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls from reporters, colleagues who'd seen the news, and family friends who wanted to know if the stories about Rachel were true. I answered each call with professional courtesy, confirmed what was already public knowledge, and declined to comment on anything that wasn't already in the newspapers. At 5 p.m., just as I was preparing to leave the office, Patricia knocked on my door one more time. "Your parents are here," she said. "They're asking to see you." My parents looked like they'd aged a decade since Thanksgiving dinner. My father's usual confident posture had collapsed into something that looked defeated, and my mother's eyes were red from crying. They sat across from my desk like clients seeking financial advice, which, in a way, they were. "We need to understand what's happening," my father said. "The reporters, the FBI agents, the lawyers. Everyone keeps talking about Rachel like she's some kind of criminal mastermind. This has to be a mistake." "It's not a mistake," I said gently. "Rachel has been systematically defrauding her clients for at least 3 years. She's stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who trusted her." "But you could have warned us," my mother said. "You could have told us what you suspected before it became this public nightmare. The way you warned me about what Rachel was planning to say at Thanksgiving dinner?" They looked at each other, and I saw the moment they realized this conversation wasn't going to go the way they'd expected. "That was different," my father said. "Rachel was frustrated." "Rachel was cruel," I interrupted. "And you both sat there and let her be cruel to a family member who is already struggling. You let her call me a burden. You let her say that you wanted to live without me. And none of you, not one of you, said a single word in my defense." "We were shocked," my mother whispered. "We didn't know what to say." "You knew exactly what to say. You chose not to say it because it was easier to let Rachel voice what you'd all been thinking for months." The silence in my office was absolute. Outside, I could hear the sounds of Seattle's evening rush hour, cars honking, people walking to buses, the normal sounds of people living normal lives. But inside my office, we sat in the wreckage of a family that had imploded not because of tragedy, but because of choices. "What happens now?" my father asked finally. "Now Rachel goes to prison, probably for 2 to 5 years if she cooperates with the FBI investigation. Mark loses his house, possibly his career, definitely his marriage. You deal with the social consequences of having raised a daughter who stole from her friends. And I continue building my new life, the one where I don't need anyone's approval or support to be successful." "You can't mean that," my mother said. "You can't just write off your entire family." "I'm not writing you off," I said. "But I'm not pretending that we're close either. Rachel showed me exactly what this family thinks of me when things get difficult. You and Dad confirmed it by staying silent. That's not something you recover from with apologies and explanations." My father leaned forward, his businessman instincts kicking in. "What would it take? What do you need from us to fix this?" "You can't fix this, Dad. This isn't a business deal or a negotiation. This is the consequence of choosing convenience over compassion, of deciding that someone's worth is determined by how much trouble they cause." I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "But if you want to do something constructive," I continued, "start by acknowledging that Rachel's crimes aren't a reflection of poor judgment or temporary moral lapse. They're a reflection of someone who believed that her comfort and success were more important than other people's trust and security. Then ask yourself where she might have learned that lesson." After they left, I sat alone in my office as darkness settled over Elliott Bay. The building was quiet except for the hum of heating systems and the distant sound of traffic. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely still. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Morrison. "Heard about the arrest. Are you okay?" I typed back, "I'm exactly where I need to be. Any regrets?" I thought about that question as I gathered my things and prepared to go home to my childhood bedroom, to the house where this whole story had started with words that cut deeper than any physical injury. Did I regret exposing Rachel's crimes?
No.
Justice demanded it. Did I regret the way I'd gone about it?
No.
Surgical precision had been necessary. Did I regret the loss of my family relationships? That was more complicated. "No regrets," I texted back. "Just clarity." But as I drove home through the December rain, past the houses where normal families were probably decorating Christmas trees and planning holiday gatherings, I realized that revenge had given me something I hadn't expected. It had given me myself back. Not the person I'd been before the accident. That woman was gone forever. But someone stronger, someone who understood that survival sometimes requires cutting away the parts of your life that are slowly poisoning you. Someone who knew that being underestimated was the greatest gift your enemies could give you. And tomorrow, I would use that gift to finish what I'd started. Christmas morning arrived gray and quiet, the kind of Seattle winter day that makes you grateful for warm coffee and the promise that spring will eventually return. I woke up in my childhood bedroom for what I decided would be the last time, surrounded by butterfly wallpaper and the ghosts of a person I used to be. The house was eerily silent. My parents had left 2 days earlier to spend Christmas with my father's sister in Portland, fleeing the media attention and the social scandal that had consumed Seattle's elite circles since Rachel's arrest. They'd invited me to come with them, but I'd declined. I had work to finish. The past week had been a masterclass in how quickly a life built on lies can collapse. Rachel had pleaded guilty to wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges in exchange for a sentence reduction and agreement to cooperate with the FBI's ongoing investigation. She would serve 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release and full restitution to her victims, approximately $340,000 that she didn't have. Mark had been cleared of criminal charges but faced disbarment proceedings from the Washington State Bar Association. The house in Queen and was being sold to pay legal fees and victim restitution. His law firm had quietly asked him to resign rather than face the scandal of having a partner married to a federal felon. But those were just the public consequences, the ones that made headlines and provided closure for the victims. The private consequences, the ones that mattered to me, were more subtle and far more satisfying. 3 days before Christmas, I'd received a phone call that changed everything. Ms. Chun? This is Victoria Chun-Williams. I wonder if we might meet for coffee. Victoria Chun-Williams didn't make social calls to people she didn't know. She was Seattle royalty, someone whose approval could make careers and whose disapproval could end them. The fact that she wanted to meet with me suggested that my reputation in the forensic accounting field was growing faster than I'd anticipated. We met at a small cafe in Capitol Hill, the same one where I'd first shown Jennifer Morrison the evidence of Rachel's crimes. Victoria arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed in the kind of understated elegance that only comes from generational wealth. "I wanted to thank you personally," she said after we'd ordered coffee. "I know it couldn't have been easy to expose your own sister's criminal activity." "It was necessary," I replied. "Justice doesn't make exceptions for family relationships." "No, it doesn't. But integrity does make some people exceptional." She paused, studying me with intelligent eyes that reminded me why she'd been successful in business despite inheriting her position. "I have a proposition for you." Victoria explained that she and several other high-net-worth individuals who'd been victims of Rachel's fraud network wanted to establish a foundation dedicated to preventing financial crimes against vulnerable populations. They needed someone to direct the foundation's investigative work, someone with the technical skills to identify complex fraud schemes, and the personal integrity to handle sensitive information discreetly. The salary would be $150,000 annually, plus benefits and a budget for investigation expenses, she said. You'd work independently, report directly to the foundation board, and have complete autonomy over case selection and methodology. It was exactly the opportunity I'd been working toward without realizing it, a chance to use my skills for something larger than corporate profit margins, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves from predators who exploited trust and vulnerability. "There's one condition," Victoria continued. "The foundation board wants to be assured that your personal situation is stable, that you won't be distracted by family drama or the ongoing legal proceedings against your sister." "My family situation is completely resolved," I told her. "I have no ongoing obligations or emotional attachments that would interfere with this work." She smiled, and I saw something that looked like approval in her expression. "Excellent. Can you start January 2nd? That had been 3 days ago. Since then, I'd given my notice at Morrison and Associates. Richard had been disappointed but understanding. found a one-bedroom apartment in Belltown with a view of the Sound, and begun the process of completely severing my ties to the life I'd lived before the accident. But there was one more thing I needed to do. One final conversation that would close this chapter of my life permanently. I drove to the Federal Detention Center on Christmas afternoon, past empty streets and closed businesses, to have a conversation I'd been planning for weeks. Rachel looked smaller in her orange jumpsuit, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. 18 months in federal prison had been reduced to 6 months with good behavior and cooperation, but 6 months was still long enough to fundamentally change someone's understanding of their place in the world. "I didn't think you'd come," she said when we sat down across from each other in the visitor's room. "I had something I wanted to tell you. More consequences I haven't considered yet. Actually, no. I wanted to tell you that I'm proud of you." She looked genuinely surprised. "Proud of me? You cooperated with the FBI investigation. You provided information that helped them identify other victims and recover stolen money. You accepted responsibility for your actions without trying to shift blame to other people. Those were brave choices." I didn't have much choice. My lawyer said cooperation was the only way to avoid spending 5 years in federal prison. "You had choices," I corrected. "You could have fought the charges, claimed you were manipulated by your co-conspirators, tried to minimize your role in the criminal network. Instead, you told the truth and accepted the consequences. That required courage." Rachel was quiet for several minutes, and when she spoke, her voice was different than I'd ever heard it before. Smaller, but somehow clearer. "I keep thinking about what I said at Thanksgiving dinner," she said. "About you being a burden. I replay that moment over and over, wondering what was wrong with me that I could say something so cruel to someone I love." "Do you love me?" I asked. "Of course I love you. You're my sister." "That's not the same thing," I said gently. "Loving someone means accepting them completely, supporting them when they're struggling, protecting them from people who want to hurt them. What you felt for me wasn't love. It was obligation mixed with frustration and resentment." "That's not true. Rachel, you called me a burden. You said our family wanted to live without me. You said those things because you believed they were true, because some part of you did see me as an inconvenience that was making your life more difficult." She started crying, the same desperate sobs I'd heard in my office the day her world collapsed. "I was wrong," she whispered. "I was so wrong about everything. About you, about what mattered, about who I wanted to be." "Yes, you were wrong. But being wrong isn't a permanent condition unless you choose to make it one." I reached across the table and took her hand, the first physical contact we'd had since before the accident. "When you get out of prison, you're going to have a chance to rebuild your life," I continued. "You'll be older, hopefully wiser, definitely humbler. You can choose to become someone who deserves the love and respect you want from other people. What about us? Is there any chance we can be sisters again?" I'd been dreading this question because I knew my answer would hurt her. But I'd learned that kindness sometimes requires brutal honesty. "No," I said simply. "We can't go back to being sisters the way we were before. Too much has happened, too much trust has been broken. But someday, maybe, we can become something different. Something based on who we actually are instead of who we used to be." "I don't know how to do that." "Start by figuring out who you are when you're not performing for other people. In prison, nobody cares about your designer clothes or your expensive car or your successful business. Figure out who Rachel Chun is when all of that is stripped away. Then decide if that person is someone you want to be." I stood up to leave, but she held onto my hand. "Meredith, how did you do it? How did you survive having your entire life destroyed and come out stronger?" I thought about that question as I looked at my sister, really looked at her, maybe for the first time since we were children. She wasn't a successful entrepreneur who dismissed me as a burden. She wasn't the cruel woman who'd tried to cut me out of our family. She was just someone who'd made terrible choices and was finally ready to face the consequences. I learned that strength isn't about avoiding pain, I told her. It's about transforming pain into something useful. Your betrayal taught me that I could survive anything. Your cruelty taught me that I didn't need anyone's approval to have value. Your crimes taught me that I was capable of seeking justice even when it was personally costly. So, I helped make you stronger? In the most painful way possible, yes. But Rachel, that doesn't mean I'm grateful for what you did. It just means I refuse to let it destroy me. I left the detention center feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd forgiven Rachel. Forgiveness would have to be earned over time, if it happened at all, but because I'd finally said everything I needed to say. The drive back to my parents' house took me through neighborhoods where I'd grown up, past schools where I'd learned to read and write, past the hospital where I'd relearned how to walk and talk after the accident. All of it felt like visiting a museum dedicated to someone else's life. That evening, I packed the last of my belongings into boxes that would go into storage until I moved into my new apartment. Clothes that no longer fit the person I was becoming, books I'd read before my brain was rewired by trauma, photographs of family gatherings that felt like evidence from a crime scene. At the bottom of my jewelry box, I found something I'd forgotten about, a friendship bracelet Rachel had made for me when she was 12 and I was 10. Pink and purple threads braided together with the kind of precision that only comes from love and endless patience. I stared at it for a long moment, remembering the little girl who'd spent hours making sure every knot was perfect. Then I threw it away. Not out of cruelty, but out of acceptance. That little girl was gone, just as surely as the woman I'd been before the accident was gone. Holding on to artifacts from relationships that no longer existed was just another form of prison. As I loaded the last box into my car, I looked back at the house where I'd grown up, where I'd learned about love and disappointment and the complex mathematics of family loyalty. It looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, like a structure that had been beautiful once but couldn't withstand the weight of the secrets it had sheltered. Tomorrow, I would start my new job protecting vulnerable people from predators who exploited trust and kindness. I would use skills I developed through trauma to prevent others from experiencing the betrayal I'd survived. But tonight, I drove toward my future with the windows down and the radio playing, finally free from the burden of trying to earn love from people who'd already decided I wasn't worth the effort. And for the first time since waking up in that hospital bed, I felt completely, genuinely happy. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the Chin Williams Foundation, looking out at Elliott Bay while presenting my findings to a room full of people who now understood that underestimating me had been their first and last mistake. The Fernandez case represents our most complex investigation to date, I told the foundation board, clicking through slides that detailed a fraud scheme involving fake investment advisors, stolen retirement funds, and elderly victims who'd lost their life savings to criminals who'd posed as financial planners. Total recovery? Asked Victoria Chin Williams from her position at the head of the table. $2.3 million returned to 47 victims, with criminal charges filed against 6 defendants in what the U.S. Attorney's Office is calling the largest elder fraud ring in Washington state history. The room erupted in applause, but I felt only quiet satisfaction. This was what justice looked like. Not revenge, not personal vindication, but systematic protection of people who couldn't protect themselves. After the meeting, I walked back to my office in the Foundation's downtown headquarters, a space I designed specifically for the kind of complex investigative work that had become my specialty. Multiple computer monitors, secure file storage, direct lines to law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest, and most importantly, complete autonomy over my case selection and methodology. I'd found my calling in the space between accounting and justice, using numbers to tell stories that criminals thought would never be discovered. In 6 months, the Foundation had recovered over $8 million in stolen funds, secured criminal convictions against 23 defendants, and established me as one of the most effective forensic investigators in the region. But success in my professional life was only part of the transformation I'd undergone since that Thanksgiving dinner that had changed everything. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Dinner tonight? I have news to share." It was from Dr. Sarah Martinez, the neuropsychologist who'd been helping me understand the cognitive changes that had resulted from my brain injury. Sarah had become more than just a doctor over the past year. She'd become a friend, someone who understood that surviving trauma doesn't mean returning to who you were before. It means becoming someone who integrates the experience into a stronger, more complete version of yourself. We met at a small restaurant in Fremont, the kind of place that served excellent food without pretense, where conversations could unfold naturally without the performance required in Seattle's more fashionable establishments. "You look happy," Sarah said as we settled into our booth. "Really, genuinely happy." "I feel happy," I replied, and realized it was completely true. For the first time since the accident, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The foundation work is fulfilling? It's more than fulfilling. It's purposeful. I'm using skills I developed through trauma to prevent other people from being victimized by predators who exploit trust and vulnerability. There's a symmetry to it that feels almost healing. Sarah smiled. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been following your work with the foundation, and I think your story could help other traumatic brain injury survivors understand that recovery doesn't mean returning to your previous life. It means building a new life that incorporates your experience." She explained that she'd been asked to contribute to a medical journal article about post-trauma personal growth, and she wanted to use my case as an example of how cognitive changes could become adaptive advantages in the right environment. Your enhanced pattern recognition, your increased attention to detail, your heightened ability to detect deception, all of these changes that initially seemed like deficits have become professional assets, she said. "You're not successful despite your brain injury. You're successful because of how you've learned to leverage the cognitive changes it created." The idea of sharing my story publicly felt both terrifying and necessary. For too long, narratives about brain injury recovery had focused on returning to normal, as if the goal was to pretend the trauma had never happened. But my experience had taught me that recovery was actually about integration, taking the person you were before, the changes created by trauma, and the wisdom gained through survival, and synthesizing them into someone stronger. "I'll do it," I told her. "But I want to include the whole story. The family dynamics, the betrayal, the revenge, all of it. People need to understand that surviving trauma isn't just a medical process. It's also an emotional and social process that requires you to reevaluate every relationship in your life." Over the next 2 hours, we outlined an article that would challenge conventional thinking about brain injury recovery while providing hope for people whose families had abandoned them during their most vulnerable moments. After dinner, I drove home to my apartment in Belltown, the one-bedroom space that had become my sanctuary. Clean lines, minimal furniture, windows that looked out over the water, where ferries carried people to new destinations. It was the opposite of my childhood bedroom with its butterfly wallpaper and accumulated memories of someone I no longer was. My laptop was open on the kitchen counter, displaying an email I'd been debating whether to answer for the past week. The sender was someone I'd never expected to hear from again. "Meredith, this is Mark. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I need to tell you something." Mark's email was long, rambling, full of apologies and explanations I didn't need to hear. He'd moved to Portland after losing his job, was working as a public defender for a fraction of his previous salary, had filed for divorce from Rachel while she was still in prison. But buried in the self-pity and justifications was something that surprised me. "I want you to know that I understand now why you did what you did. I spent months being angry, feeling like you destroyed our family for revenge. But watching Rachel's victims testify at her sentencing hearing, seeing the real impact of what she'd done, I realized that you weren't trying to hurt us. You were trying to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That took courage I don't think I would have had." He went on to say that our parents were slowly coming to the same realization, that they'd begun to understand their silence at Thanksgiving dinner had been its own form of cruelty. He asked if there was any possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship, not as the family we'd been before, but as something new and more honest. I closed the laptop without responding. Maybe someday I'd be ready for that conversation, but not yet. Forgiveness was a process, not a decision, and I was still working through the complex emotions of loving people who'd failed me when I needed them most. Instead, I opened a new document and began writing something I'd been thinking about for weeks. A letter to Rachel. "Dear Rachel," I began. "Tomorrow marks 1 year since the Thanksgiving dinner that changed both of our lives forever. I thought you should know how I'm doing, not because I need your approval or understanding, but because I think you might benefit from seeing what it looks like when someone chooses growth over bitterness. I wrote about the foundation, about the victims we'd helped, about the satisfaction of using my skills to protect vulnerable people from predators. I wrote about my friendship with Sarah, about the medical journal article that would help other brain injury survivors, about the apartment where I felt safe and independent for the first time since the accident. But mostly, I wrote about forgiveness, not the easy kind that pretends terrible things never happened, but the hard kind that acknowledges pain while choosing not to be defined by it. I don't forgive you because what you did wasn't that bad, I wrote. I forgive you because holding on to anger was preventing me from becoming the person I was meant to be. Your cruelty taught me about my own capacity for strength. Your betrayal taught me about my ability to seek justice even when it was personally costly. Your crimes taught me that I could use my worst experiences to protect other people from similar pain. I explained that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean we could go back to being the sisters we'd been before. But it did mean I no longer needed her to be different than she was in order for me to be happy with who I'd become. When you get out of prison, I concluded, you'll have a chance to decide who you want to be. I hope you choose to become someone who deserves the love and respect you want from other people. But whether you do or not, my happiness and success no longer depend on your choices. I've learned to build my own life with my own values, based on my own understanding of what makes existence worthwhile. I printed the letter and put it in an envelope addressed to the Federal Correctional Facility where Rachel was serving her sentence. Then I walked to the mailbox on the corner and dropped it in, feeling like I was finally sending away the last piece of the person I'd been before the accident. Standing on that street corner, looking up at the Seattle skyline where the Space Needle glowed against the night sky, I realized something that made me smile. I'd spent 14 months after my accident trying to get back to the life I'd had before. The job, the apartment, the relationships, the sense of security that came from being who everyone expected me to be. But that person had been too small for the experiences I'd survived, too limited for the strength I'd developed, too constrained by other people's expectations to become who I was truly meant to be. The accident had destroyed my old life, but it had also freed me to build something better. My family's betrayal had broken my heart, but it had also taught me that I was strong enough to survive alone. Rachel's cruelty had shattered my illusions about unconditional love, but it had also shown me that I could seek justice even when it cost me everything I thought I wanted. And my revenge, surgical, systematic, devastating, had given me back the one thing I'd thought was lost forever: respect for my own capabilities. I walked home through the quiet streets of my chosen neighborhood, past the windows of people living their own complicated stories of triumph and failure, love and loss, betrayal and redemption. I was no longer the successful accountant who'd been proud of her predictable life, no longer the brain injury victim who'd needed other people's approval to feel valuable. I was Meredith Chun, Director of Forensic Investigations at the Chun-Williams Foundation. I was someone who used mathematics to protect vulnerable people from predators. I was someone who'd learned that strength isn't about avoiding pain, it's about transforming pain into something useful. I was someone who discovered that the greatest revenge against people who underestimate you is becoming so successful that their opinions become irrelevant. And tomorrow, I would wake up in my own apartment, go to my own office, and continue building a life that proved that surviving betrayal doesn't make you bitter. It makes you wise enough to choose your battles and strong enough to win them. But tonight, I was simply grateful to be exactly who I'd become, someone who'd learned that hitting rock bottom isn't the end of your story. It's just the solid ground you need to build something that can't be destroyed by anyone else's cruelty or limitations. And from that foundation, you can build anything you want, even yourself. Asterisk, if you've made it to the end of this story, I want to thank you for taking this journey with me. Recovery isn't just about healing from trauma. It's about learning who you can become when you stop trying to please people who've already decided you're not worth their effort. Asterisk. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt underestimated or dismissed by people who are supposed to love you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that strength can come from the most painful experiences, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming too successful to need anyone else's validation. Asterisk, your support means everything. Thank you for listening. Asterisk.